This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Mysticism, A Study in Nature and Development of Spiritual Consciousness by Evelyn UNDERHILL. First half of Part 2, Chapter 9. The Dark Night of the Soul. We have wandered during the last few chapters from our study of the mystical life process in man, the organic growth of his transcendental consciousness, in order to examine the byproducts of that process, its characteristic forms of self-expression, the development of its normal art of contemplation, and the visions and voices, ecstasies and raptures, which are frequent, though not essential, accompaniments of its activity. But the mystic, like other persons of genius, is man first and artist afterwards. We shall make a grave though common mistake if we forget this and allow ourselves to be deflected from our study of his growth in personality by the wonder and interest of his art. Being, not doing, is the first aim of the mystic, and hence should be the first interest of the student of mysticism. We have considered for convenience' sake all the chief forms of mystical activity at the halfway house of the transcendental life. But these activities are not, of course, peculiar to any one stage of that life. Ecstasy, for instance, is as common a feature of mystical conversion as of the last crisis, or mystic marriage of the soul, whilst visions and voices, in cells of a visionary or auditive type, accompany and illustrate every phase of the inward development. They lighten and explain the trials of purgation as often as they express the joys of illumination, and frequently mark the crisis of transition from one mystic state to the next. One exception, however, must be made to this rule. The most intense period of that great swing back into darkness, which usually divides the first mystic life, or illuminative way, from the second mystic life, or unitive way, is generally a period of utter blankness and stagnation, so far as mystical activity is concerned. The dark night of the soul, once fully established, is seldom lit by visions or made homely by voices. It is of the essence of its miseries that the once possessed power of horizon or contemplation now seems wholly lost. The self is tossed back from its hard-won point of vantage. Impotence, blankness, solitude are the epithets by which those immersed in this dark fire of purification describe their pains. It is this period in the life history of the mystic type to which we have now come. We have already noticed the chief psychological characteristics of all normal mystical development. We have seen that its essence consists in the effort to establish a new equilibrium, to get, as it were, a firm foothold upon transcendent levels of reality, and that in its path towards this consummation the self experiences a series of oscillations between states of pleasure and states of pain. Put in another way, it is an orderly movement of the whole consciousness towards higher centres, in which each intense and progressive affirmation fatigues the immature transcendental powers, and is paid for by a negation, a swing back of the whole consciousness, a stagnation of intellect, a reaction of the emotions, or an inhibition of the will. Thus the exalted consciousness of divine perfection, which the self acquired in its mystical awakening, was balanced by a depressed and bitter consciousness of its own inherent imperfection, and the clash of these two perceptions spurred it to that laborious effort of commendation which constitutes the purgative way. The renewed and ecstatic awareness of the Absolute which resulted, and which was the governing characteristic of illumination, brought its own proper negation, the awareness, that is to say, of the self's continued separation from, and incompatibility with, that Absolute which it has perceived. During the time in which the illuminated consciousness is fully established, the self, as a rule, is perfectly content, believing that in its vision of eternity, its intense and loving consciousness of God, it has reached the goal of its quest. Sooner or later, however, psychic fatigue sets in. The state of illumination begins to break up, the complementary negative consciousness appears, and shows itself as an overwhelming sense of darkness and deprivation. This sense is so deep and strong that it inhibits all consciousness of the transcendent, and plunges the self into the state of negation and misery which is called the dark night. We may look at the dark night, as at most other incidents of the mystic way, from 2 points of view. 1. We may see it with the psychologist, as a moment in the history of mental development, governed by the more or less mechanical laws which so conveniently explain to him the psychic life of man. Or, 2, with the mystic himself, we may see it in its spiritual aspect as contributing to the remaking of character, the growth of the new man, his transmutation in God. Psychologically considered, the dark night is an example of the operation of the law of reaction from stress. It is a period of fatigue and lassitude following a period of sustained mystical activity. It is one of the best established laws of the nervous system, says Starbuck, that it has periods of exhaustion if exercised continuously in one direction, and can only recuperate by having a period of rest. However spiritual he may be, the mystic, so long as he is in the body, cannot help using the machinery of his nervous and cerebral system in the course of his adventures. His development on its psychic side consists in the taking over of this machinery, the capture of its centres of consciousness, in the interests of his growing transcendental life. In so far, then, as this is so, that transcendental life will be partly conditioned by psychic necessities, and amenable to the laws of reaction and of fatigue. Each great step forward will entail lassitude and exhaustion for that mental machinery which he has pressed unto service and probably overworked. When the higher centres have been submitted to the continuous strain of a developed illuminated life, with its accompanying periods of intense fervour, lucidity, deep contemplation, perhaps of visionary and auditive phenomena, the swing back into the negative state occurs almost of necessity. This is the psychological explanation of those strange and painful episodes in the lives of great saints, indeed of many spiritual persons hardly to be classed as saints, when, perhaps after a long life passed in faithful correspondence with the transcendental order, growing consciousness of the presence of God, the whole inner experience is suddenly swept away, and only a blind reliance on past conviction saves them from unbelief. The great contemplatives, those destined to attain the full stature of the mystic, emerge from this period of destitution, however long and drastic it may be, as from a new purification. It is for them the gateway to a higher state. But persons of a less heroic spirituality, if they enter the night at all, may succumb to its dangers and pains. The great negation is the sorting-house of the spiritual life. Here we part from the nature mystics, the mystic poets, and all who shared in and were contented with the illuminated vision of reality. Those who go on are the great and strong spirits, who do not seek to know, but are driven to be. We are to expect, then, as a part of the conditions under which human consciousness appears to work, that for every affirmation of the mystic life there will be a negation waiting for the unstable self. Progress in contemplation, for instance, is marked by just such an alternation of light and shade, at first between consolation and aridity, then between dark contemplation and sharp intuitions of reality. So, too, in selves of extreme nervous instability, each joyous ecstasy entails a painful or negative ecstasy. The states of darkness and illumination coexist over a long period, alternating sharply and rapidly. Many seers and artists pay in this way, by agonizing periods of impotence and depression, for each violent outburst of creative energy. Rapid oscillations between a joyous and a painful consciousness seem to occur most often at the beginning of a new period of the mystic way, between purgation and illumination, and again between illumination and the dark night. For these mental states are, as a rule, gradually not abruptly established. Mystics call such oscillations the game of love in which God plays, as it were, hide-and-seek with the questing soul. I have already quoted a characteristic instance from the life of Woolman Merswan, who passed the whole intervening period between his conversion and entrance on the dark night, or school of suffering love, in such a state of disequilibrium. Thus, too, Madame Guyon, who has described with much elaboration of detail her symptoms and sufferings during the oncoming and duration of the night, or, as she calls its intensest period, the mystic death, traces its beginning in short recurrent states of privation or dullness of feeling, such as ascetic writers call aridity, in which the self loses all interest in and affection for those divine realities which had previously filled its life. This privation followed upon, or was the reaction from, an illuminated period of extreme joy and security, in which, as she says, the presence of God never left me for an instant, but how dear I paid for this time of happiness, for this possession which seemed to me entire and perfect, and the more perfect the more it was secret, and foreign to the senses, steadfast and exempt from change, was but the preparation for a total deprivation, lasting many years, without any support or hope of its return. As Madame Guyon never attempted to control her states, but made a point of conforming to her own description of the resigned soul as God's weathercock, we have in her an unequalled opportunity of study. I endured, she says, long periods of privation, towards the end almost continual, but still I had from time to time inflowings of thy divinity so deep and intimate, so vivid and so penetrating, that it was easy for me to judge that thou wast but hidden from me and not lost. For although during the times of privation it seemed to me that I had utterly lost thee, a certain deep support remained, though the soul knew it not, and she only became aware of that support by her subsequent total deprivation thereof. Every time that thou didst return with more goodness and strength, thou didst return also with greater splendour, so that in a few hours thou didst rebuild all the ruins of my unfaithfulness, and didst make good to me with profusion all my lost. Here we have, from the psychological point of view, a perfect example of the oscillations of consciousness on the threshold of a new state. The old equilibrium, the old grouping round a centre characterized by pleasure affirmation, has been lost. The new grouping round a centre characterized by pain negation is not yet established. Madame Guyon is standing, or rather swinging, between two worlds, the helpless prey of her own shifting and uncontrollable psychic and spiritual states. But slowly the pendulum approaches its limit. The states of privation become almost continual. The reactions to illumination become less. At last they cease entirely. The new state is established, and the dark night has really set in. The theory here advanced that the dark night is, on its psychic side, partly a condition of fatigue, partly a state of transition, is borne out by the mental and moral disorder which seems, in many subjects, to be its dominant character. When they are in it, everything seems to go wrong with them. They are tormented by evil thoughts and abrupt temptations, lose grasp not only of their spiritual, but also of their worldly affairs. Thus Lucy Christine says, "Often during my great temptations to sadness, I am plunged in such spiritual darkness that I think myself utterly lost in falsehood and illusion, deceiving both myself and others. This temptation is the most terrible of all." The health of those passing through this phase often suffers. They become odd, and their friends forsake them. Their intellectual life is at a low ebb. In their own words, trials of every kind, exterior and interior crosses, abound. Now trials, taken en bloc, mean a disharmony between the self and the world with which it has to deal. Nothing is a trial when we are able to cope with it efficiently. Things try us when we are not adequate to them, when they are abnormally hard or we abnormally weak. This aspect of the matter becomes prominent when we look further into the history of Madame Guyon's experiences. Thanks to the unctuous and detailed manner in which she has analysed her spiritual griefs, this part of her autobiography is a psychological document of unique importance for the study of the dark night as it appears in a devout but somewhat self-occupied soul. As her consciousness of God was gradually extinguished, a mental and moral chaos seems to have invaded Madame Guyon and accompanied the more spiritual miseries of her state. So soon as I perceived the happiness of any state, or its beauty, or the necessity of a virtue, it seemed to me that I fell incessantly into the contrary vice. as if this perception, which though very rapid was always accompanied by love, were only given to me that I might experience its opposite. I was given an intense perception of the purity of God, and so far as my feelings went, I myself became more and more impure. For in reality this state is very purifying, but I was far from understanding this. My imagination was in a state of appalling confusion, and gave me no rest. I could not speak of thee, O my God, for I became utterly stupid. Nor could I even grasp what was said when I heard thee spoken of. I found myself hard towards God, insensible to his mercies. I could not perceive any good thing that I had done in my whole life. The good appeared to me evil, and, that which is terrible, it seemed to me that this state must last for ever. This world as well as the next seemed leagued against her. Loss of health and friendship, domestic vexations, increased and kept pace with her interior griefs. Self-control and power of attention were diminished. She seemed stupefied and impotent, unable to follow or understand even the services of the Church, incapable of all prayer and all good works, perpetually attracted by those worldly things which she had renounced, yet quickly wearied by them. The neat edifice of her first mystic life was in ruins. The state of consciousness which accompanied it was disintegrated, but nothing arose to take its place. It is an amazing thing, says Madame Guyon naively, for a soul that believed herself to be advanced in the way of perfection, when she sees herself thus go to pieces all at once. So too Suso, when he had entered the upper school of the spiritual life, was tormented not only by temptations and desolations, but by outward trials and disabilities of every kind, calumnies, misunderstandings, difficulties, pains. It seemed at this time as if God had given permission both to men and demons to torment the servitor, he says. This sense of a generally inimical atmosphere, and of the dimness and helplessness of the ego oppressed by circumstances, is like the vague distress and nervous sensibility of adolescence, and comes in part from the same cause, the intervening period of chaos between the break-up of an old state of equilibrium and the establishment of the new. The self, in its necessary movement towards higher levels of reality, loses and leaves behind certain elements of its world, long loved but now outgrown, as children must make the hard transition from nursery to school. Destruction and construction here go together. The exhaustion and ruin of the illuminated consciousness is the signal for the onward movement of the self towards other centres. The feeling of deprivation and inadequacy, which comes from the loss of that consciousness, is an indirect stimulus to new growth. The self is being pushed into a new world where it does not feel at home, has not yet reached the point at which it enters into conscious possession of its second or adult life. Thou hast been a child at the breast, a spoiled child, said the eternal wisdom to Suso. Now I will withdraw all this. In the resulting darkness and confusion, when the old and known supports are thus withdrawn, the self can do little but surrender itself to the inevitable process of things, to the operation of that unresting spirit of life which is pressing it on towards a new and higher state, in which it shall not only see reality, but be real. Psychologically, then, the dark night of the soul is due to the double fact of the exhaustion of an old state and the growth towards a new state of consciousness. It is a growing pain in the organic process of the self's attainment of the Absolute. The great mystics, creative geniuses in the realm of character, have known instinctively how to turn these psychic disturbances to spiritual profit. Parallel with the mental oscillations, upheavals and readjustments, through which an unstable psychophysical type moves to new centres of consciousness, run the spiritual oscillations of a striving and ascending spiritual type. Gurans gurando vadit spiritus. The machinery of consciousness, overstretched, breaks up and seems to toss the self back to an old and lower level, where it loses its apprehensions of the transcendental world. As the child, when first it is forced to stand alone, feels weaker than it did in its mother's arms. For first he not only withdraws all comfortable, observable infusions of light and grace, but also deprives her of a power to exercise any perceptible operations of her superior spirit, and of all comfortable reflections upon his love, plunging her into the depth of her inferior powers, says Augustine Baker, the skilled director of Stoll's, here anticipating the modern psychologist. Here, consequently, he continues, her former calmness of passions is quite lost, neither can she introvert herself. Sinful motions and suggestions do violently assault her, and she finds as great difficulty, if not greater, to surmount them as at the beginning of a spiritual course. If she would elevate her spirit, she sees nothing but clouds and darkness. She seeks God, and cannot find the least marks or footsteps of his presence. Something there is that hinders her from executing the sinful suggestions within her, but what that is she knows not, for to her thinking she has no spirit at all, and indeed she is now in a region of all other most distant from spirit and spiritual operations. I mean, such as are perceptible. Such an interval of chaos and misery may last for months, or even for years, before the consciousness again unifies itself and a new centre is formed. Moreover, the negative side of this new centre, the new consciousness of the Absolute, often discloses itself first. The self realizes, that is to say, the inadequacy of its old state, long before it grasps the possibility of a new and higher state. This realization will take two forms. A. Objective, the distance or absence of the Absolute which the self seeks. B. Subjective, the self's weakness and imperfection. Both apprehensions constitute a direct incentive to action. They present, as it were, a divine negation which the self must probe, combat, resolve. The dark night, therefore, largely the product of natural causes, is the producer in its turn of mystical energy, and hence of supernatural effects. 2. So much for psychology. We have next to consider the mystical or transcendental aspects of the dark night. See what it has meant for those mystics who have endured it, and for those spiritual specialists who have studied it in the interests of other men. As in other phases of the mystic way, so here we must beware of any generalization which reduces the dark night to a uniform experience, a neatly defined state which appears under the same conditions and attended by the same symptoms, in all the selves who have passed through its pains. It is a name for the painful and negative state which normally intervenes between the illuminative and the unitive life, no more. Different types of contemplatives have interpreted to themselves and to us in different ways, each type of illumination being in fact balanced by its own appropriate type of dark. In some temperaments it is the emotional aspect, the anguish of the lover who has suddenly lost the beloved, which predominates. In others, the intellectual darkness and confusion overwhelms everything else. Some have felt it, with St. John of the Cross, as a passive purification, a state of helpless misery, in which the self does nothing, but lets life have its way with her. Others, with Suso and the virile mysticism of the German school, have experienced it rather as a period of strenuous activity and moral conflict directed to that total self-abandonment which is the essential preparation of the unitive life. Those elements of character which were unaffected by the first purification of the self, left as it were in a corner when the consciousness moved to the level of the illuminated life, are here roused from their sleep, purged of illusion, and forced to join the grooving stream. The dark night, then, is really a deeply human process in which the self which thought itself so spiritual, so firmly established upon the supersensual plane, is forced to turn back, to leave the light, and pick up those qualities which it had left behind. Only thus, by the transmutation of the whole man, not by a careful and departmental cultivation of that which we like to call his spiritual side, can divine humanity be formed, and the formation of divine humanity, the remaking of man according to the pattern showed him in the Mount, is the mystic's only certain ladder to the real. My humanity, said the eternal wisdom to Suso, is the road which all must tread, who would come to that which thou seekest. This hard saying might almost be used as a test by which to distinguish the genuine mystic life from its many and specious imitations. The self in its first purgation has cleansed the mirror of perception. Hence, in its illuminated life has seen reality. In so doing, it has transcended the normal perceptive powers of natural man, immersed in the illusions of sense. Now it has got to be reality, a very different thing. For this a new and more drastic purgation is needed, not of the organs of perception, but of the very shrine of self, that heart which is the seat of personality, the source of its love and will. In the stress and anguish of the night, when it turns back from the vision of the infinite to feel again the limitations of the finite, the self loses the power to do, and learns to surrender its will to the operation of a larger life, that it may be. At the end of such a long and cruel transition, says Lucy Christine, how much more supple the soul feels itself to be in the hand of God, how much more detached from all that is not God. She sees clearly in herself the fruits of humility and patience, and feels her love ascending more purely and directly to God, in proportion as she has realized the nothingness of herself and all things. We must remember in the midst of our analysis that the mystic life is a life of love, that the object of the mystic's final quest and of his constant intuition is an object of adoration and supreme desire. With thee, a prison would be a rose garden, O thou ravisher of hearts. With thee, hell would be paradise, O thou cheerer of souls, said Jalaluddin. Hence for the mystic who has once known the beatific vision, there can be no greater grief than the withdrawal of this object from his field of consciousness, the loss of this companionship, the extinction of this light. Therefore, whatever form the dark night assumes, it must entail bitter suffering, far worse than that endured in the purgative way. Then the self was forcibly detached from the imperfect. Now the perfect is withdrawn, leaving behind an overwhelming yet impotent conviction of something supremely wrong, some final treasure lost. We will now look at a few of the characteristic forms under which this conviction is translated to the surface consciousness. A. To those temperaments in which consciousness of the Absolute took the form of a sense of divine companionship, and for whom the objective idea, God, had become the central fact of life, it seems as though that God, having shown himself, has now deliberately withdrawn his presence, never perhaps to manifest himself again. He acts, says Eckhart, as if there were a wall erected between him and us. The eye which looked upon eternity has closed. The old dear sense of intimacy and mutual love has given place to a terrible blank. That which this anguished soul feels most deeply, says St. John of the Cross, is the conviction that God has abandoned it, of which it has no doubt, that he has cast it away into darkness as an abominable thing. The shadow of death and the pains and torments of hell are most acutely felt, and this comes from the sense of being abandoned by God, being chastised and cast out by his wrath and heavy displeasure. All this and even more the soul feels now, for a terrible apprehension has come upon it that thus it will be with it for ever. It has also the same sense of abandonment with respect to all creatures, and that it is an object of contempt to all, especially to its friends. So, too, Madame Guyon felt this loss of her intuitive apprehension of God as one of the most terrible characteristics of the night. After thou hadst wounded me so deeply as I have described, thou didst begin, O my God, to withdraw thyself from me, and the pain of thy absence was the more bitter to me, because thy presence had been so sweet to me, thy love so strong in me. Thy way, O my God, before thou didst make me enter into the state of death, was the way of the dying life, sometimes to hide thyself and leave me to myself in 100 weaknesses, sometimes to show thyself with more sweetness and love. The nearer the soul drew to the state of death, the more her desolations were long and weary. Her weaknesses increased, and also her joys became shorter, but purer and more intimate, until the time in which she fell into total privation. When this total privation or mystic death is fully established, it involves not only the personal absence of God, but the apparent withdrawal or loss of that impersonal support, that transcendent ground or spark of the soul, on which the self has long felt its whole real life to be based. Hence its very means of contact with the spiritual world vanishes, and as regards all that matters, it does indeed seem to be dead. When we have reached this total deprivation, says de Caussade, what shall we do? Abide in simplicity and peace, as Job on his ash-heap, repeating, Blessed are the poor in spirit, those who have nothing have all since they have God. Quit all, strip yourself of all, says the great Gerson, and you will have all in God. God felt, God tasted and enjoyed, says Fenelon, is indeed God, but God with those gifts which flatter the soul. God in darkness, in privation, in forsakenness, in insensibility, is so much God, that he is, so to speak, God bare and alone. Shall we fear this death, which is to produce in us the true divine life of grace? B. In those cells for whom the subjective idea sanctity, the need of conformity between the individual character and the transcendent, has been central, the pain of the night is less a deprivation than a new and dreadful kind of lucidity. The vision of the good brings to the self an abrupt sense of her own hopeless and helpless imperfection, a black conviction of sin far more bitter than that endured in the way of purgation, which swamps everything else. That which makes her pain so terrible is that she is, as it were, overwhelmed by the purity of God, and this purity makes her see the least atoms of her imperfections as if they were enormous sins, because of the infinite distance there is between the purity of God and the creature. This, says St. John of the Cross again, is one of the most bitter sufferings of this purgation. The soul is conscious of a profound emptiness in itself, a cruel destitution of the three kinds of goods, natural, temporal, and spiritual, which are ordained for its comfort. It sees itself in the midst of the opposite evils, miserable imperfections, dryness and emptiness of the understanding, and abandonment of the spirit in darkness. C. Often combined with the sense of sin and the absence of God is another negation, not the least distressing part of the sufferings of the self suddenly plunged into the night. This is a complete emotional lassitude, the disappearance of all the old ardours now replaced by a callousness, a boredom, which the self detests but cannot overcome. It is the dismal condition of spiritual ennui, which ascetic writers know so well under the name of aridity, and which psychologists look upon as the result of emotional fatigue. It seems incredible that the eager love of a divine companion, so long the focus of the self's whole being, should have vanished, that not only the transcendent vision should be withdrawn, but her very desire for and interest in that vision should grow cold. Yet the mystics are unanimous in declaring that this is a necessary stage in the growth of the spiritual consciousness. When the sun begins to decline in the heavens, says Rusbroek, it enters the sign Virgo, which is so called because this period of the year is sterile as a virgin. This is the autumn season in the cycle of the soul, when the summer heat grows less. It perfects and fulfils the yearly travail of the sun. In the same manner, when Christ, that glorious Sun, has risen to his zenith in the heart of man, as I have taught in the 3rd degree, and afterwards begins to decline, to hide the radiance of his divine sunbeams, and to forsake the man, then the heat and impatience of love grow less. Now that occultation of Christ and the withdrawal of his light and heat are the first work and the new coming of this degree. Now Christ says inwardly to this man, Go ye out in the manner which I now show you. And the man goes out and finds himself to be poor, miserable, and abandoned. Here all the storm, the fury, the impatience of his love grow cool. Glowing summer turns to autumn. All its riches are transformed into a great poverty. And the man begins to complain because of his wretchedness. For where now are the ardours of love, the intimacy, the gratitude, the joyful praise, and the interior consolation, the secret joy, the sensible sweetness? How have all these things failed him? and the burning violence of his love, and all the gifts which he felt before. How has all this died in him? And he feels like some ignorant man who has lost all his learning and his works. And of this misery there is born the fear of being lost, and as it were a sort of half-doubt. And this is the lowest point at which a man can hold his ground without falling into despair. D. This stagnation of the emotions has its counterpart in the stagnation of the will and intelligence, which has been experienced by some contemplatives as a part of their negative state. As regards the will, there is a sort of moral dereliction. The self cannot control its inclinations and thoughts. In the general psychic turmoil, all the unpurified part of man's inheritance, the lower impulses and unworthy ideas which have long been imprisoned below the threshold, force their way into the field of consciousness. Every vice was reawakened within me, says Angela of Foligno. I would have chosen rather to be roasted than to endure such pains. Where visual and auditory automatism is established, these eruptions from the subliminal region often take the form of evil visions, or voices making coarse or sinful suggestions to the self. Thus St. Catherine of Siena, in the interval between her period of joyous illumination and her spiritual marriage, was tormented by visions of fiends, who filled her cell and with obscene words and gestures invited her to lust. She fled from her cell to the church to escape them, but they pursued her there, and she obtained no relief from this obsession until she ceased to oppose it. She cried, "I have chosen suffering for my consolation, and will gladly bear these and all other torments in the name of the Saviour, for as long as it shall please His Majesty." With this act of surrender the evil vision fled. Catherine swung back to a state of affirmation, and was comforted by a vision of the cross. An analogous psychological state was experienced by St. Teresa, though she fails to recognize it as an episode in her normal development, and attributes it, with other spiritual adventures for which she can find no other explanation, to the action of the devil. The soul, she says, laid in fetters, loses all control over itself, and all power of thinking of anything but the absurdities he puts before it, which, being more or less unsubstantial, inconsistent, and disconnected, serve only to stifle the soul, so that it has no power over itself. And accordingly, so it seems to me, the devils make a football of it, and the soul is unable to escape out of their hands. It is impossible to describe the sufferings of the soul in this state. It goes about in quest of relief, and God suffers it to find none. The light of reason, in the freedom of its will, remains, but it is not clear. It seems to me as if its eyes were covered with a veil. Temptations seem to press it down and make it dull, so that its knowledge of God becomes to it as that of something which it hears of far away. This dullness and dimness extends to ordinary mental activity, which shares in the lassitude and disorder of the inner life. If it seeks relief from the fire by spiritual reading, it cannot find any, just as if it could not read at all. On one occasion it occurred to me to read the life of a saint, that I might forget myself and be refreshed with the recital of what he had suffered. 4 or 5 times I read as many lines, and though they were written in Spanish, I understood them less at the end than I did when I began, so I gave up. It so happened to me on more occasions than one. If we are reminded of anything here, it is of the phenomenon of dark contemplation. That dimness of mind which we there studied is here extended to the normal activities of the surface intelligence. The cloud of unknowing, rolling up, seems to envelop the whole self. Contemplation, the way within the way, has epitomized the greater process of this mystic life. In both, the path to light lies through a meek surrender to the confusion and ignorance of the dark. The stress and exasperation felt in this dark, this state of vague helplessness by selves of an active and self-reliant type, is exhibited by Teresa in one of her half-humorous self-revealing flashes. The devil, she says of it, then sends so offensive a spirit of bad temper that I think I could eat people up. all these types of darkness, with their accompanying and overwhelming sensations of impotence and distress, are common in the lives of the mystics. Suso and Rulman Mersman experienced them. Tauler constantly refers to them. Angelo Foligno speaks of a privation worse than hell. It is clear that even the joyous spirit of Mechthild of Magdeburg knew the sufferings of the loss and absence of God. "Lord," she says in one place, "since thou hast taken from me all that I had of thee, yet of thy grace leave me the gift which every dog has by nature, that of being true to thee in my distress, when I am deprived of all consolation. This I desire more fervently than thy heavenly kingdom." In such a saying as this, the whole value for life of the Dark Night is revealed to us as an education in selfless constancy, a school of suffering love. E. There is, however, another way in which the self-sense of a continued imperfection in its relation with the Absolute, of work yet remaining to be done, expresses itself. In persons of a very highly strung and mobile type, who tend to rapid oscillations between pain and pleasure states, rather than to the long, slow movements of an ascending consciousness, attainment of the unitive life is sometimes preceded by the abrupt invasion of a wild and unendurable desire to see God, apprehend the transcendent in its fullness, which can only, they think, be satisfied by death. As they begin to outgrow their illuminated consciousness, these selves begin also to realize how partial and symbolic that consciousness, even at its best, has been, and their movement to union with God is foreshadowed by a passionate and uncontrollable longing for ultimate reality. This passion is so intense that it causes acute anguish in those who feel it. It brings with it all the helpless and desolate feelings of the dark night, and sometimes rises to the heights of a negative rapture, an ecstasy of deprivation. St. Teresa is perhaps the best instance of this rare method of apprehending the self's essential separation from its home, which is also the subject of a celebrated chapter in the Traité de l'amour de Dieu of St. François de Sales. Thanks to her exceptionally mobile temperament, her tendency to rush up and down the scale of feeling, Teresa's states of joyous rapture were often paid for by such a great desolation, a dark ecstasy or pain of God. As long as this pain lasts, she says, we cannot even remember our own existence, for in an instant all the faculties of the soul are so fettered as to lie incapable of any action save that of increasing our torture. Do not think I am exaggerating. On the contrary, that which I say is less than the truth, for lack of words in which it may be expressed. This is a trance of the senses and the faculties, save as regards all which helps to make the agony more intense. The understanding realizes acutely what cause there is for grief in separation from God, and our Lord increases this sorrow by a vivid manifestation of himself. The pain thus grows to such a degree that in spite of herself the sufferer gives vent to loud cries which she cannot stifle, however patient and accustomed to pain she may be, because this is not a pain which is felt in the body, but in the depths of the soul. The person I speak of learned from this how much more acutely the spirit is capable of suffering than the body. The intense and painful concentration upon the divine absence which takes place in this dark rapture often induces all the psychophysical marks of ecstasy. Although this state lasts but a short time, the limbs seem to be disjointed by it, the pulse is as feeble as if one were at the point of death, which is indeed the case, for whilst the natural heat of the body fails, that which is supernatural so burns the frame that with a few more degrees God would satisfy the soul's desire for death. You will say, perhaps, that there is imperfection in this desire to see God, and ask why this soul does not conform herself to his will, since she has so completely surrendered herself to it. Hitherto she could do this, and consecrated her life to it, but now she cannot, for her reason is reduced to such a state that she is no longer mistress of herself and can think of nothing but her affliction. Far from her sovereign good, why should she desire to live? She feels an extraordinary loneliness, finds no companionship in any earthly creature. Nor could she, I believe, among those who dwell in heaven, since they are not her beloved. Meanwhile all company is torture to her. She is like a person suspended in mid-air, who can neither touch the earth nor mount to heaven. She burns with a consuming thirst, and cannot reach the water. And this is a thirst which cannot be borne, but one which nothing will quench. Nor would she have it quenched with any other water than that of which our Lord spoke to the Samaritan woman, and this water is denied her. All these forms of the dark night, the absence of God, the sense of sin, the dark ecstasy, the loss of the self's old passion, peace, and joy, and its apparent relapse to lower spiritual and mental levels, are considered by the mystics themselves to constitute aspects or parts of one and the same process, the final purification of the will or stronghold of personality, that it may be merged without any reserve in God where it was first. The function of this episode of the mystic way is to cure the soul of the innate tendency to seek and rest in spiritual joys, to confuse reality with the joy given by the contemplation of reality. It is the completion of that ordering of disordered loves, that transvaluation of values, which the way of purgation began. The ascending self must leave these childish satisfactions, make its love absolutely disinterested, strong, and courageous, abolish all taint of spiritual gluttony. A total abandonment of the individualistic standpoint, of that trivial and egotistic quest of personal satisfaction which thwarts the great movement of the flowing light, is the supreme condition of man's participation in reality. Thus is true not only of the complete participation which is possible to the great mystic, but of those unselfish labours in which the initiates of science or of art become to the eternal goodness what his own hand is to a man. Think not, says Tauler, that God will be always caressing his children, or shine upon their head, or kindle their hearts as he does at the first. He does so only to lure us to himself, as the falconer lures the falcon with its grey hood. We must stir up and rouse ourselves, and be content to leave off learning, and no more enjoy feeling and warmth, and must now serve the Lord with strenuous industry and at our own cost. This manly view of the dark night, as a growth in responsibility, an episode of character-building, in which, as the Mirror of Simple Souls has it, the soul leaves that pride and play wherein it was full gladsome and jolly, is characteristic of the German mystics. We find it again in Suso, to whom the angel of his tribulation gave no sentimental consolations, but only the stern command, Virilite agite, be a man. Then first, says Tauler again, do we attain to the fullness of God's love as his children, when it is no longer happiness or misery, prosperity or adversity that draws us to him, or keeps us back from him. What we should then experience none can utter, but it would be something far better than when we were burning with the first flame of love, and had great emotion, but less true submission. End of first half of Part 2, Chapter 9.